Alrighty guys, so we're moving on. Next objective is objective 4. And objective 4 is about things that we have to have in order to survive. So there's 4 main requirements for human life. We have oxygen, nutrients, a steady temperature, and a steady pressure. So the first one is oxygen. And we all know that we have to breathe in oxygen and that we exhale CO2. If you notice up here that really the air around us is a lot of nitrogen, and so the oxygen is just a smaller percentage of the air that you breathe in. But the reason it's essential is because we have to have oxygen in order to produce energy. So this molecule right here, you're going to see this little ATP molecule. You're going to see it popping up several times throughout the course. ATP, anytime you see this acronym, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. ATP equals energy. So always, always, always. Now, in order for our cells to make energy, we have to eat. We have to get sugars from the foods that we eat. But in order to make ATP efficiently, we have to have oxygen. So down here is the chemical equation for a process called cellular respiration. And so we eat foods, we get sugars, like this right here is glucose. We get glucose from the foods that we eat. But we have to breathe in oxygen because the process of cellular respiration requires oxygen in order to make the ATP. So this process here is why we have to have food. It's why we have to breathe in oxygen. It's also why we exhale carbon dioxide. And so in the event that we do not have oxygen, we cannot continue to make ATP for our cells efficiently. And so the cells will essentially stop working. We need energy to do all different types of activities, cell transport, muscle contraction, a whole lot of processes require ATP. And so if we don't have oxygen, as fast as 10 minutes, death could occur. So that is why oxygen is such an important element, and we have to breathe it in. It's all about making energy for our cells. We also need nutrients. Like you saw in the equation in the last slide, we had to have sugars. Sugars help give us what we need to produce that ATP molecule again. You can see it again down here. So nutrients are just substances that are in our foods and drinks, and we have to have them for survival. So a big one is water. We know that we should be drinking lots of water each day. Most of our body is water. Our cells are filled with solutions, and around our cells are solutions. And so there's all different types of chemicals that are dissolved in water and transported in water. Your blood has a lot of water. The interstitial fluids between your tissues and things like that, they all have lots of water in them. And water is what we call the universal solvent, which means it's really good at dissolving stuff. So it's kind of just the backbone of the solutions in our body. It also helps regulate our body temperature. Water changes temperature very gradually, and so it keeps us from getting too hot or too cold too quickly. So it kind of helps moderate those temperatures. It can cushion the organs, it can be protective, and then of course it can lubricate things like joints, help reduce friction. So water is what we consider a macronutrient. We've seen this prefix before. Macro means big or large. And so a macronutrient is just something that's required in large quantities. And so we have to have lots and lots of water because there's a lot of different functions, and it's a medium for all of our chemical reactions. Another important macronutrient are carbohydrates. In a future unit, in chapter 2, we're going to talk about macromolecules, and carbohydrates are going to be one of those. And carbs are sugars. A lot of us are familiar with carbs because they're tasty, things like breads and pastas, and there's carbs in fruits. But carbs are sugars, and this is the main molecule that we use to make ATP in that cellular respiration reaction that we saw in the previous slide. So carbohydrates are super important. There's good carbs and bad carbs. They aren't all bad. And so it's important that we have them to make energy for our cells, along with that oxygen molecule that we talked about. Another important macronutrient are lipids, and lipids are fats and oils. A lot of times fats get a bad rap, but we need them for energy. Fats actually store large amounts of energy. They also make up our cell membranes, and some of our hormones or lipids, but we need to have fats in our diet and take those in. Proteins, that's important for things like muscle building. There's all different types of proteins in our bodies with all different types of functions. They're made up of a molecule or smaller molecules called amino acids, and so when you eat protein, we need those amino acids that are there to build other proteins. And then a micronutrient, which means we need them in smaller quantities, are vitamins and minerals. So things like vitamin D, vitamin C. Minerals are just elements. So anything that you can find on the periodic table, calcium, sodium, potassium, all of those are examples of minerals. So in order for us to survive, we have to eat and drink and get these nutrients from those foods. So here's our first question for this objective. So another name for minerals, and then what are some examples? Well, minerals are also elements, and you could put anything that's on the periodic table here. So, you've got sodium, potassium, calcium, iron, pretty much anything that's over here, you could list here. All right, the next requirement is temperature. So earlier in this PowerPoint, there was a section about metabolism. And metabolism are all the different chemical reactions that are taking place in our cells, in our body. Well, in our body, our chemical reactions work best around that 98.6 body temp. Now, if you ever see this in Celsius, it's about 37 degrees Celsius. So in order for our chemical reactions and metabolism to kind of stay on track and work like it needs to, we need that steady temperature. And so we know that if we have a fever, it can be very serious. Or if we were to get too cold, that can be very serious. And the reason why is because of these very special proteins known as enzymes. And we'll talk about them again later as well. But enzymes are proteins that regulate chemical reactions. And if the temperature gets too far away from this ideal, what will happen is they'll lose their shape. And if a protein loses its shape, it loses its function. And so our chemical reactions are not going to take place properly. They're going to slow down. And when they don't take place fast enough, it could ultimately lead to death in serious cases. So that's why a high fever is super dangerous, because we don't want our proteins to denature. So we want to make sure that we have a steady body temp. And then the last requirement is a stable pressure. And so pressure is just the force exerted by a substance when it comes in contact with something else. And so what we need is a steady, constant atmospheric pressure. And so we know that, if you change altitude, things like that, there can be pressure changes and they have effects on our body. And so the gases that are out there in our atmosphere, they put pressure on the earth. And these gases actually help keep, or the pressure actually helps keep the gases dissolved in our body like they need to. If the pressure changes too much, like if we were to go into outer space or something like that, it'll cause those gases to expand and create bubbles, and we wouldn't want those things happening in our blood. It's also important just to maintain pressure just for things like breathing, being able to inhale and exhale. If you get into, really deep waters or you go to really high altitudes, it can affect your body in some extreme ways, and your breathing can change. It can become harder to breathe, harder to take breaths. So we just kind of need a steady atmospheric pressure as well. So a couple more questions about this objective. So to maintain life, all organisms depend on, one of our absolutes that we must have is oxygen. And then which of the following are directly involved in making energy known as ATP? So the nutrients that were involved, the ones that specifically helped us make ATP are carbohydrates. So we have to have oxygen and we have to have carbohydrates, and both of those together actually help us make ATP. And that covers objective 4. So I'll see you again in the video on objective 5.